Alright, so this is going to be an assembly video for Ebony and Ivory. This is Ivory, but Ebony is basically going to be the exact same process. Now, as a disclaimer, this is a prop gun, does not shoot or function at all. It's not even possible to load anything in there, and the magazine is just for show. Now, a few things that you're going to need for this build if you want the trigger, slide, and hammer to work are some springs. I don't have the specs for these offhand, but I'm going to have them in the description. This one I picked up at Home Depot, and it's a little bit larger and thicker than these ones that I got in an assorted case on Amazon, which I'll try to have the link for these as well in the description. You'll also need some of these machine screws to connect the extension bar here to the frame and the muzzle. I got these on Amazon in another assortment pack, and I believe the ones that I used were the M4x8. Now for attaching the grip, I wanted to get some gold slotted flathead screws, and the only thing that I could find were these machine screws at Home Depot, but they're much too large, so I took a Dremel and just cut them. And when assembling, hole tolerances are insanely difficult to get right and perfect, especially when you're printing in resin or printing with FDM and your printer settings. So they're as close as I could get them, but I would recommend having a Dremel handy if you need to increase the holes even by the slightest when trying to get pieces like these pins in. So I'm going to disassemble this and then show you all the pieces and we'll reassemble it. All right, now that I have everything disassembled, I'm going to just go over a few things that I did after printing the parts. Any area that had sliding or moving parts, I would sand down as smooth as possible, starting with just 220 grit sandpaper. But you have to keep in mind that if you're going to be painting this, or when you're painting this, don't get paint on any area where there needs to be tolerance. So an example here is don't get paint in the slide, because then when you go to put the slide on, it is going to jam up and it is going to grind all the paint. I had that issue on my first version of Ebony and Ivory. Originally the slide was supposed to function, but I didn't really pay attention to that and painted everything, and it just became a solid piece. So what I did for this model is researched how an actual 1911 works, because the base design for this is a 1911. It is just heavily modified. And a lot of the sizing for Ebony and Ivory doesn't make sense, so I had to tweak a lot of these components quite a bit to get them to function, which is partly why the trigger mechanism takes up this entire section in the back. There are quite a few very tiny parts, which is why I decided to print this one in resin and not FDM. I don't know how well some of these are going to come out when trying to print them with an FDM printer. I was also testing some different materials for the grip. This one is PLA Plus on an FDM printer. Has a bit of give, so it's not too bad when trying to put it on. This one is printed in resin. Now there's not a whole lot of give on this one, so this one has to go on pretty gently, and it does grind quite a bit when putting it on, so it's definitely going to tear up some paint probably. But once it's on, it sits pretty nicely. Now the third one I tested was this flexible resin, which I'm actually pretty impressed with. It almost comes out like a rubber. And it sands pretty nicely. I just haven't tested painting it yet. But putting this one on, I mean, I can just bend it open, slide it in, clamp it down. And it's pretty good at retaining its form. Although this stuff is fairly expensive compared to the standard resin. I think it's almost double the price. But the rest of this stuff was printed in standard resin. As an example of something I would use the Dremel to increase the hole tolerance would be a piece like these for the grip, because it really depends on the size of the screw that you're using. And when you're trying to thread something, especially with resin, if the hole is too small and you're trying to thread it, it can crack the resin. So you want it to almost be the exact same size as the outer diameter of the screw. But all I would do is just take the Dremel on a low speed and just grind on the inside a little bit. And test threading it until it went through smooth. And that also goes for any pin connectors here, like the one in the trigger. If it's too difficult to push through, just take the Dremel, grind it out a little bit on the inside very lightly, and keep trying until it slides in nicely. All right, so the first piece is going to be this housing for the spring on the back of the frame. There is a cap that needs to sit inside and up at the top, because this strut is going to be pushing against that cap, which is going to give tension to the hammer. With the opening facing up, I'm just going to drop that in and let it slide and sit at the top here, which is now going to be sitting here at the bottom. You're going to take the spring, which is going to be one of the larger ones, which is the 732 by 1.5 inch, and just slide that down. Okay, there we go. And just to give it a little test. Yeah. All right, so that piece is assembled. All right, so the first thing we're going to assemble is the trigger mechanism. It's just easier to get it in the frame and then build everything else around it. All right, so for the trigger, you're going to take the trigger piece and the connector, slide the connector in, line it up with the hole, and lock it in with this pin. And this should sit flush. There we go. So that should be perfectly flush. All right, so before we put the trigger in, because it doesn't lock in place until we put it into the frame, we're going to put the sear and disconnector in, which are these two pieces here. First thing we have to do is put the spring in the back that's going to keep tension on the disconnector. So it's going to be one of these smaller springs, the 732 by 11/16. So that's going to sit in the back, and then you're going to have this little cap. This is going to keep pressure on the disconnector. But you got to put this in first. So once that piece is in there, you're going to try to rest the sear and disconnector on top of it and line the hole up like that. Then you're going to have to take the pin, try to slide that in without losing tension. There we go. Now you can see that the sear and disconnector have tension. Now for the trigger, you're going to take the longer spring, which is the 732 by 1.5 inch, slide it in the top. This one may seem a little oversized, but it is just to give enough tension to push the trigger back. So take that, slide that in, line up the rails. There we go. So see, so that's in. All right, so there's the trigger mechanism. Now I feel like it can get a little sticky, especially with just the friction of the raw parts rubbing on each other. Now I haven't tried it yet, but I would like to see if putting some grease on the rails in here just helps make this a little smoother. Okay, so this is the next day, and I did pick up some of this multi-purpose silicone grease. I tried to find something that wasn't going to erode any plastic or resin, so this seemed to be a good option. So I'm going to test putting this on some of these tracks here for the trigger, see if it smooths it out. Oh yeah, that feels way better. So if you are making this, I would definitely recommend just picking some of this up. I'll put a link in the description. It's not too expensive. I think it was like 10, 15 bucks for this bottle, and I used like a drop on my finger. But yeah, way smoother. All right, well, back to the actual assembly. But now once it's assembled, you're going to keep the trigger pressed down. You're going to insert it into the frame trigger first, just until it gets around the entrance there. Put some pressure on it. Slide the rest in. And then once it's in, you're going to have to keep the trigger pressed down all the way. Just push down, release it, and it should just lock into place. All right, now that the trigger is in, we can move along to the hammer and the safety grip and housing. So you're going to take the hammer with the strut, line this up to the second hole here, and drop its pin in. And that should sit flush. Now that that's in, you're going to take the housing with the spring, line it up so the strut goes into the hole, push it in place, and drop in the housing pin until it sits flush. Then you can take the safety grip, which has a little indent here, so it should sit just right on top of the housing, and sit flush there. Take the safety, slide that in, and then there you go. So the back is all assembled. Once all that's in, then the hammer should work. Okay. Perfect. Now I did make this part separate, even though it doesn't really do anything. It's supposed to be like the trigger release, but it makes no sense with this, the way that this is designed, because a typical 1911 doesn't have this type of trigger. So it makes sense that when it goes through, it could lock the trigger in place here, but it's nowhere near it. So I just, I just made it a separate piece, maybe in the future if I was going to do something with it. But it really just slides into this slot here. And that's it for that piece. So we can put the slide on. And once the slide's on, we can take the barrel. Now you're going to want to try to, actually I already have these pieces assembled, but there is a little barrel link and pin that are going to attach here. So, and just make sure you have this, I think the smaller end is at the top and the larger end is at the opening down here for this little link. But you're going to drop that through, and you're going to want to try to line it up with this hole here. Then you're going to take the, I think this is like the slide lock, but I forgot. Try to slide that in through it. And then just press it in. All right, so that'll lock the barrel in place. Now here you got to try to set this spring and have it line up with the rails here, so that when the extension bar goes on, it all locks in place. There we go. And now you can put in a machine screw to lock the extension bar to the frame. I did leave openings on the inside of the frame for a little lock nut if there's no tension when screwing this in, just so that it has something to kind of, lock into. But I think for the most part, these are just going to thread into the plastic or the resin, so you probably aren't going to need the nut in the back. I'm going to pull the slide back just to expose the barrel because the barrel's a little loose in the front. You're going to take the muzzle, slide the muzzle over the barrel and just get that in place. And then you can release the slide and just try to line up the hole here and get the next screw in. Okay, now that that's in, the slide should just move freely. Perfect. Now you're going to take your grip, slide the grip on over top, and you're going to have to measure these screws unless you get some that are the proper size. They're just really hard to find with a slotted head so that it looks exactly how it does in the game. But I kind of just eyeballed it and just cut it to get it in there. But I'm just going to put one in for now. There we go. So grip is attached. And the magazine. That's it. Fully assembled. And then I also included a little like plug so that if you wanted to like print it in orange, you could kind of just slide it in here if you're going to a convention that required your guns to have those little orange caps. But there you go. That is probably the most detailed assembly I can give for this. So if you have any issues still, just drop a comment and I can try to help you out the best I can. And thank you for buying my model.